Welcome to the Free Marketeers, the official podcast of the Free Market Foundation. Hello listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Free Marketeers. I'm Martin van Staden, and I'm joined today here, as always, by Chris Hattingh and Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. So this week has been pretty hectic for me and Mpiyakhe. So we did not have any of our own podcasts this week. Chris did his on the 75th anniversary of The Road to Serfdom by F.A. von Hayek, and I would advise everyone to go and listen to that and some of the implications that book still holds today and in society. But next week, hopefully, everything will be back to normal. Mpiyakhe was in Cape Town this week on an unemployed project, FMF trying to get South Africans working again in association with the Langeberg Unemployed Forum. And I did my book launch this week. That should be available on our YouTube channel where you're listening to this. But yeah, so without further ado, let's get into what's been in the news this week. And that, I think, has been dominated mostly by this upcoming decision by the Council of the University of Cape Town to boycott Israeli institutions. Now, I was somewhat caught off guard by this. I didn't know it was coming up, but so suddenly the council, I don't know, it's the Academic Freedom Committee, I believe, that has recommended this decision to the University Council. I'm not sure of the details, but basically it will amount to a refusal by UCT to engage with any academic institution in Israel, from the state of Israel. I'm not sure if that includes the so-called Palestinian territories. So, yeah, I was wondering what you guys think about this phenomenon. Do you think a public university, any public institution for that matter, should be able to dictate to, for instance, academics and students to who and with who they may have contact or not? Yeah, so Chris, give me your view on this.
Well, regardless of your views on the Israel-Palestine conflict, if UCT, I'm sure if you go and read any vision, mission statements, anything in their official policies, if there's anything about academic freedom, this is a radical departure from that. This sort of silencing of differing views. You know, the university itself and this council, maybe the VC, all the lecturers, all the students even could agree that Israel is evil, etc., etc. But if you're committed to academic freedom in any substantial manner, surely, it doesn't indicate that you actually believe it if you just want to silence any differing views. That's sort of my point of departure. You have to look at what their stance has been in the past on academic freedom, whether they've actually lived up to that in their actions. I mean, it's all well and good. We talk a lot about politicians talking a big game in their speeches and things, and when it comes to actual delivery and stuff, they fall short. So you have to sort of weigh up what UCT is now doing compared to what they've said in the past. But yeah, it's I guess it follows the trend nowadays of being in favor of some sort of freedom, but then actually, if it's different from your view, you're not going to entertain it very long. And to me, it's quite scary to see from one of South Africa's leading universities that it's even being talked about.
Yeah, and Mpiyakhe, so do you think that a resolution like this would apply to a university from Saudi Arabia or Iran as well? Do you think that this is a consistent, principled condemnation of nations generally that have poor track records of human rights? Or do you think this may just be a singling out of a particular state?
Well, I think that if this is done for principled reasons or whatever the reasons might be, then you would assume that I'm sure that countries that have violated human rights are all going to be next. But it's just even if that is, let's say, for example, they targeted all the countries that have a bad record on violating human rights on earth. They let's say for argument's sake they did that, it would still be wrong, because if you think about it, you are taking academics as proxies for their country's governments, which is not how we should think of governments. Imagine if we thought of UCT academics as proxies for government policy.
Right.
That would be weird, because academics by their nature are sometimes often even opposed to government policy. That's their role. They are supposed to be able to think freely, to be free, to be unfettered from any sort of government involvement. So by doing this, the UCT is sort of subverting the case, their own case for academic freedom, free from the government. And so let's say what they are saying now is that, okay, Israeli academics are proxies for their government's policy. And so the government can come in the other day and say to them, oh, you said these Israeli academics are proxies for their government's policy, then you have to be proxies for our policy, because that's how you think of that's how you think of academics should be. And so it's just a weird thing, because within UCT itself there are many academics who disagree with each other. There are many who disagree on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and that's true of any university. Go to Israel, and then you will see that there are many academics who disagree with the government's policy on the Palestine issue, on that conflict. And so it's just a weird thing for any university to fall in. And it's also an instance of collective punishment, because they are basically saying, oh, because these particular people in government have pursued the particular policies that we don't like, then we will just punish everyone in Israel without context, without considering what these individuals themselves, what their views are, which is just, it seems so wrong in so many levels that I can't believe that any university would ever do this.
Yeah, I think that actually brings up an important point. So during the apartheid era in South Africa, there were broadly, I would say, three categories of universities. You had the so-called bush colleges, not a very good term for it, but these were mostly universities propped up by government that were designed for black people exclusively. And these universities didn't really do much in the field of research. Then you had the what I would say probably the conservative or Afrikaner universities. It's University of Pretoria, Potchefstroom, Stellenbosch, maybe what is today known as UJ, University of Johannesburg. These mostly had pro-apartheid intellectuals who always defended the government and said, yes, apartheid is a good policy, it makes sense. And then you had the open universities, that is the University of Cape Town, Rhodes, Wits, and KZN, yes, University of KwaZulu-Natal. And what I think the UCT academics or the administrators are forgetting is that during the apartheid era, the academics from the open universities were at the forefront of fighting apartheid, especially in the international realm. So you had professors like John Dugard from Wits, Dennis Cohen, I think he was from UCT. They were going around the world speaking at foreign universities, condemning apartheid, and not just condemning apartheid, also doing general academic research and so forth. But this same privilege is not being extended to Israel. So basically all Israeli universities are being swept under the same rug, being blamed, as you pointed out, Mpiyakhe, for their government's actions. Whether you happen to agree with that government's actions or not is irrelevant. The point is that students, presumably tens of thousands of students and hundreds if not thousands of academics, are just being given the responsibility for what their government has done, and to do that is basically to say something about South African history as well, basically saying that the United States, Europe, Asia, whatever, should have just said, no, we are our universities are not going to engage with South African institutions, and therefore all the anti-apartheid activists who find themselves at South African academic institutions, they'll just have to stay put and make do without our assistance. So I think there's something terribly wrong inherent in this. The assumptions that underlie this thing are just flawed, and I think there's some political posturing here that's not really, doesn't really have anything to do with academia, intellectualism, and definitely not with academic freedom, because this is the Academic Freedom Committee, very ironic, that made this recommendation to the UCT Council. Now just Mark Oppenheimer advocate Mark Oppenheimer, we requested him to do an opinion on this, and his conclusion is pretty much legally, from where I'm sitting, correct, and in that he says that UCT is an organ of state, and the Constitution does regard these public institutions as organs of state. And as such, it is bound by the Bill of Rights, and Section 16.1 of the Bill of Rights says that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, and that includes academic freedom. Now, clearly, I would say there's a clear violation of the academic freedom of both the students and the staff, academic staff at the University of Cape Town, if this resolution is passed. So I definitely would recommend that UCT think very long and hard about this, because more than likely this is going to lead to court battles that are definitely going to make their way to the Constitutional Court. And I would be surprised if the Constitutional Court finds in favor of the boycott rather than the individual academic freedom of the staff and students at UCT. So do you guys have anything more on this topic?
Just with anything on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, we should be especially careful because of the implications thereof for thought, writing, speech, people's speech in general, both the students and the academics. So you have to consider, if, for example, you are very pro-Palestine and you believe that Israel is perpetuating atrocities and that kind of thing, the best way to expose that and to convince people of your case is to debate with the opposing viewpoint. And it's not going to work to just silence people. Otherwise, students, they're not going to be exposed to any different views. I understand that some positions are very upsetting to people, and you get sort of, it's in the in your very heart of hearts, you get upset by certain issues, but you maybe owe it to yourself and your own sort of intellectual integrity to at least hear an opposing view and then decide for yourself. You can't say you've come to your position with integrity and rigor, and as a student or as an academic, if you haven't actually considered other positions and heard them out. That doesn't mean you listen to them for days and days and days. At least it just means that you hear someone out and then you decide for yourself. So yeah, I'm very scared of this kind of thing at universities in general and in society. We know about the hate speech bill in South Africa. That's what has the same sort of implications, where we talk a lot about diversity in South Africa and are concerned that there's a lot of racism and people aren't being integrated. But if it's enforced integration and enforced diversity, then it's vague and it's only in name. It's not real. There's no real brotherly love kind of thing. The only way for people to be truly diverse and to embrace those values is for it to be a ground up thing, for them to actually interact with each other, that sort of thing. So I don't know. I'm very worried about it, and I guess it now sets a precedent for UCT. So yeah, it'll sort of be more downhill from here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Justin, it's an indicator of a worrying trend of the university seeming to, there seem to be more and more moves within UCT itself to control the academics within UCT, and this will probably drive away a lot more. If these people get their way, that's why are trying to control what academics teach, what they research, and all of these things. Then you will tend to, I think, in a few years' time, you will see more and more academics not finding UCT as a good place to go to, because it usually gets a lot of academics from overseas in other places visiting UCT and teaching there, doing their research there. And so if they continue imposing more and more restrictions, one of the other things that happened was this curriculum change framework thing, where they were basically going to dictate to what academics would be teaching in the classroom. And so if luckily that seems to have gone by the wayside, but the fact that there are these moves within the university to restrict speech and they keep coming up, it's just a relentless thing. It shows that there is quite a significant constituency within the university of people who want to do away with free speech, with academic freedom, and who just want to have control. And that's a worrying sign, considering that universities are supposed to be these hotbeds of free speech where people who disagree with each other can debate each other and hopefully come to a conclusion. But even if they don't, but they can get to air their views and people can decide for themselves what they want to believe in. I mean, during apartheid, you probably would have seen people who are pro-apartheid and who are anti-apartheid at UCT debating each other. But now it seems as if it's only people that the people who just happen to be in management agree with will now have the chance to speak, and no one else is allowed to speak. And if the student body feels offended by a particular speaker, then they won't get to hear those views, which is such a perversion of what academic freedom and free speech is supposed to mean.
Yeah, so talking about freedom of expression, the other thing that's been in the news this week has been the utterances by a particular individual who is quite prominent in South African politics, who at some point, I believe about a year or two ago, said that something along the lines of, we're not calling for the killing of a specific race of people yet. And that understandably annoyed some South Africans, maybe more caused them grave concern rather than annoyed them, and they took him to the South African Human Rights Commission on a charge of hate speech. The South African Human Rights Commission came back this week with their finding and said basically that there is no hate speech here. And I'm not too sure of their reasoning. Either of you may have read more into it, but I think they said something along the lines of, there is no imminent call for violence, or well, the other thing that I saw is that because he said he's not calling for the killing, the slaughtering of those people yet, clearly he said that he's not calling for it, which to me is a very interesting contextual analysis of what he was saying. So Mpiyakhe, I know you've also read some of what's been going on here. What are your views on this ruling by the SHRC?
So I agree with the ruling itself, because I don't believe that we should criminalize what's so-called hate speech. That's just my personal view. So I agree with the ruling itself, but I disagree with the reasons for the ruling, because it's so arbitrary. It basically, what the SHRC has said here is that if you are white and you say the same things that Julius Malema said, and you say it's about, let's say, black people or Indian people, then they might rule differently than what they've ruled here. And that is so arbitrary to be. I don't understand how that could be accepted in a constitutional dispensation based on individual rights. Because what they are saying here is that they are going to use arbitrary criteria such as race, which has no basis at all, which has no objective basis, no scientific basis. They are going to use that criteria in determining their rulings as a Chapter 9 institution, and I just can't see how that can pass moral muster, can pass constitutional muster. You can comment on more on this, Martin, but I just don't. For me, that was the most troubling thing for me, was the justification for their ruling. While I actually agree with the ruling that they shouldn't have made a finding against the individual concerned here for the utterances he made, because I mean, like, the free speech is one of the consequences of having free expression and free speech in a society. People will say things that upset you, so that's accepted. I don't like what he said, but he should be allowed to say it.
Chris, what do you think about the so-called, I mean, if you look at libertarian and liberal thought over the last few years, there has been a lot of talk about the so-called difference between free speech on the one hand and hate speech on the other. I don't know, do you or Ayn Rand have any specific thing to say about that so-called distinction?
Now you're really going to get me in trouble if Rand herself heard someone calling her a libertarian, geez. And I don't vociferously stand up for that, important distinction between objectivism and libertarianism. I think she might condemn me very harshly. But so a few points. Number one, on the matter of arbitrariness and your area of expertise, especially the rule of law, no one in a society can know really how to act or what is legal or illegal if there's arbitrariness within the rule of law. So when the Human Rights Commission, for example, makes these rulings based on those reasons that Mpiyakhe spelled out, you might agree with the ruling, but the reasons make it so that there's nothing in the future to tell us, where it's going to go, because it's so arbitrary. So that's one point. And then number two, wherever it comes from the left or the right, whenever people use race as, sort of their basis for judging whether something is moral or how people should act, it really, really gets me going. Because it's almost as though the last, I don't know, since we can count the start of human civilization, it's like we ignore everything that people have done based on something as arbitrary as the color of your skin. That's an accident of your birth. I mean, okay, going back to the objectivism thing, Rand herself, I think one of the topics that really got her going, apart from maybe religion, for example, was racism. And the fact that you group people according to their race, and then you think you can make judgments based on their moral character, that they're good or evil people, when you no longer use their actions to judge them. for her, that was, one of the worst things, one of the worst intellectual and moral mistakes you could commit. So this, I guess, talking about the UCT thing, this is again in that trend of society heading in this direction that we're trying to, I don't know, maybe it's an example of lazy thinking, where we don't want to look at people's context and their actions. We just want to think, oh, you're in this race group, therefore, you're now forever morally condemned. So it's very worrying. And I guess it shouldn't be surprising, because we know society is heading in this direction. But if you do value free speech in any, I think, substantial way, you need to protect it, I think, absolutely. No matter whether someone utters hate speech, at least, and we have, it's clear what we've defined hate speech in the, and you would obviously be clearer on whether you think it's adequately defined, but it's there. And if you commit the crime, then you'll be punished accordingly. Now, why? I don't know why we think we should put more and more qualifiers on it. It's just going to become more and more arbitrary.
Sorry to step, but like I think one of the things that Firial Hafachi, the journalist, said on Twitter was that the SHRC now has decided that it's going to use relative past disadvantage relative to current advantage and all of this. So there's going to be a ratio that if you were less oppressed in the past, let's say for example as an Indian person you are less oppressed than a black person, and you say something against a black person, then your words are going to undergo greater scrutiny, and there's going to be a higher chance that it will be classified as hate speech. And so now she was just saying that, and then an employee of the SHRC, tweeting in her personal capacity, replied and said that no, that's not what the ruling said at all. It just said that we'll consider other things that indicate any disadvantage, like poverty and inequality in the past and ongoing present. Which was strange, because if you look at the individual content here, he when it comes to poverty and inequality, he's actually wealthy, and he's at the top of, or his people, all of us are unequal compared to him. So if you just look at the individual's content, that seems to make no sense here, because inequality is not. You can get an aggregate number for whatever group that you want to measure for poverty and inequality. I mean, I could say, okay, I want to look at the population of people who work at the FMF versus the population of people who work at Anglo-American, and all of us will look worse off, of course, in terms of poverty and inequality.
That's news to me. I thought we were funded by like the Koch brothers.
Oh, poor Chris. But so if you can choose an arbitrary grouping, so you can say, okay, Mr. Malema has this particular concentration of melanin on his skin, so we're gonna take the same people who have roughly the same concentration of melanin, calculate these numbers for them, poverty and inequality, and say, okay, no, this because this group that he's in tends to be poor, even though he himself is not poor, then we're gonna say, oh, his hate speech is less severe than someone else's hate speech because he just happens to belong to a group, even though a group that has these other numbers associated with it, even though he himself doesn't have the same numbers, which seems to defy all logic to me.
Yeah, no, look, so I think you both brought up important points. Now, the fact is that hate speech is defined in the Constitution. The Human Rights Commission did not need to get creative with how it treated this issue. Hate speech is defined as advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. Now, I think you can definitely make the argument either way and say that this was or was not something that complies with that definition. And I think I'm broadly with Mpiyakhe in that I think probably that if you take this case on a very unemotional and dispassionate analysis, you will probably find that this was not hate speech, at least not insofar as it is punishable by law. And I think the HRC was probably right in its conclusion. But these things, this totally arbitrary thing that you need to look at what group the speaker and the victim, the so-called victims, are a part of to determine whether hate speech is present is totally unconstitutional. It's completely arbitrary and is totally in contravention with the imperatives of the rule of law, which require some real reasonableness and rationality in these things. What we saw here was that certain people on the Human Rights Commission who are ideologically convinced of a particular position, and I would broadly categorize them in the critical race theory area of academia probably, they have now breathed that into the institutional culture of the Human Rights Commission. And I can only say thank God that the Human Rights Commission is not actually a court that sets precedent. Hopefully, if this is appealed, the courts will say, yes, the conclusion was correct, but what the Human Rights Commission said here and here is totally invalid as far as our constitutional values go, because Section 16, which says government may prohibit hate speech, does not in any way, shape, or form imply that when determining hate speech or some other kind of prohibited speech, that a distinction can be made on race. I mean, the other things that are prohibited in Section 16.2, or not prohibited, but enable that government may prohibit, is incitement for war and incitement to imminent violence. Now imagine how ridiculous it would be if we came to a legal position whereby if a Indian person said South Africa must invade Zimbabwe, that would be okay. But if a black person said South Africa must invade Zimbabwe, he'll be arrested and charged with treason. I mean, come on, that would be totally ridiculous. And it's the same reason why these things that the Human Rights Commission here have said are totally ridiculous. Now, I think this is totally incompatible with our constitutional values of non-racialism, of equality of rights, equality of obligations under the Constitution. And I find it somewhat distressing that a Chapter 9 institution, now Chapter 9 is titled Institutions Safeguarding Constitutional Democracy. That is extremely concerning, that the Human Rights Commission would be doing some nonsense or saying nonsense like this. Yeah, it's quite concerning. You guys have anything more on that?
Yeah, just a last point on the importance of linguistics and language and definitions. So we should never, I think we're diluting a lot of, actual racism. For example, when you brand farm murders as white genocide, or when when someone uses the K word or the N word, for example, these things are starting to lose meaning because we're just labeling everything now as hate speech or racism, and we're doing away with actual harm being perpetuated on people. So you need to be careful and think clearly about in what situations you apply these things. And this decision now by the HRC sort of just, I don't know, it's another part of the process of diluting the actual meaning of words. And that again has an impact on, people's view of law and free speech and these sorts of things.
There's just something that I just remembered that I wanted to add, maybe a bit controversially, in that while I do agree that what the individual who was under question here said was probably not hate speech, I do think that within the context of the election that we are currently looking at, 8th May is our general election, and we have an electoral code, and we have certain constitutional values that are supposed to be reflected by everyone who intends to participate in that election. Otherwise, they show contempt for the very Constitution itself. I think we need to, there's something to be said for perhaps telling this individual that he needs to stop doing this, otherwise risk not being able to participate in the election. Because I mean, there are certain radical white parties that I think equally comply under the thing that I'm pointing out here, in that they do not represent the values that underlie the Constitution: non-racialism, freedom, equality, human dignity. And I think what this individual said does not indicate a respect for freedom, equality, or human dignity, even though I do not think he should be jailed for this. I don't know if you have anything to say in response to that.
No, I just one comment that there was another individual who was reported for breaching the electoral code for basically banning certain races from joining his party, and so that's but he was eventually allowed to register. So I don't know how these things work, but that was just interesting. Yeah, it's also very. I mean, I don't see the rule of law here, so I don't know.
People, when, for example, we bring up 1984 by George Orwell and sort of Orwellian think, and what he tried to point out about tyrannical governments, that kind of thing. People say libertarians are being speaking in hyperbole, and we're worried about government and tyranny. But this is a real example of how this stuff comes. It's not, as I mentioned in my podcast on Hayek, what he also wrote about in The Road to Serfdom. It's not tyranny doesn't come overnight. It's a slow
Yes.
process in a lot of situations. Maybe there'll be an armed coup in some countries, by a dictator. But a lot of the times, these individual liberties, free speech, freedom of expression, property rights, these things are taken away over time. So you need to be very, very vigilant, and we can't take it for granted.
Yeah, and the only way to safeguard these things is for government to have, or the people to be vigilant, but government also to have a very healthy respect for the imperatives of the rule of law, to ensure that they act rationally, reasonably, effectively, and definitely proportionally to what they're dealing with, which our government, I don't think, has exhibited in many of the things that it's done. So yeah, thank you, listeners, for joining us again this week for another episode of the Free Marketeers. Please remember to subscribe to this channel. It's the big red button right under the video. To follow us on Twitter, that is at FMF South Africa, one word. Like us on Facebook, that's Free Market Foundation South Africa, or in the URL, it's facebook.com/FMFSA. And then, of course, visit our website, freemarketfoundation.com, and the Rule of Law Project's website, ruleoflaw.org.za, which now contains that legal opinion that we requested from Advocate Oppenheimer on this situation at UCT. So yeah, thank you for listening. Cheers.